So, like I said, this is much more than just Zionism. I will talk about Zionism towards the end, and I'll explain why the need for a Jewish homeland is there. This is contextualization. Once again, I don't know that you need to write all of this, but, whatever you think is super important. I'm going to give us a little mood lighting, if that's okay. If this makes it blind. Jews in 18th century Europe, you probably know this is the 1700s. Before really the Enlightenment has taken hold of many places, they're treated as resident aliens, going all the way back to the period of time when, in the Middle Ages, when Jews are being persecuted, they're treated as resident aliens. They're allowed to live in various places, essentially is what's going on. But they are separate in many ways. Religiously separate, obviously, and in a period of time when people consider their religion or take their religion very seriously, it makes it okay from time to time to kill Jewish people. And certainly it makes it okay to persecute them on a daily basis because they're considered to be damned. So, who cares, essentially. Legally, they're separate as well. They are allowed to live in places at the permission of the king, for the most part. Oftentimes protected by the king, oftentimes then also allowed to be persecuted by the king. Physically separated as well. In cities, they're oftentimes placed in ghettos, or a certain section of the city is walled off for them. This both protects them and keeps them separate from quote-unquote good Christian people. But it also protects them. They have gates that close so that Christian people can't get in and cause mischief unless they break down the gates and do that. There's also quite a number of Jewish people who live in Eastern Europe in little tiny villages. Just a village filled with Jewish people living among many villages of non-Jewish people. And once again, it makes it easier to persecute the Jewish people who are living together in a village. Anti-Semitism for a really long period of time is just straight up based on religion. And it's okay then when you convert from Judaism to Christianity. Do you remember, 1492, Columbus both sails the ocean blue, but then also Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain demand that all the Jews either leave Spain or convert. Yeah. So you convert, you're okay. You get baptized, you're good. That works for a long period of time. And in fact, there are famous converts. Or there are people who converted and then their kids make it big in history. Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of Britain, his father converted to Anglicanism. Papa Marx, the father of Karl Marx, converts to Lutheranism as well. And, I'm sure his Papa Marx was disappointed in his son in many ways, but one of them being, he becomes an atheist. Religion is the opium of the masses. But just as an example of people who do convert and it's okay. For Jews, for a long period of time, they can't do what they want to do. They can't belong to a guild. They can't work many professions. They can't be lawyers, for example, or they can't serve in the bureaucracy of all of these states. They can't be healers or physicians. They can't go where they want to go. That's true for many people, but in particular for Jews. They can't reside where they want to reside. Oftentimes there are these places that are just off limits to Jews, or Jews are only allowed to live in certain places. And periodically there are pogroms, a kind of organized or semi-organized riot against Jewish people. Sometimes, like in Russia, for real political purposes, and sometimes just based on sort of the chaotic happenings of the time. A lot of the time, things would happen like a child would go missing. And for whatever reason, the local people would blame Jews, and then they would, persecute Jewish people and kill Jewish people. It just is a very normal thing. The Enlightenment comes along, and the elite becomes less devoted to religion, and some open-minded people become, tolerant of various Christian sects, but then also a little bit tolerant of Jews as well. Just, once again, you don't have to slavishly just write this down, but just to give you an idea of where Jews are living in the 18th century, the 1700s, I think what's important is the top number. Where do the bulk of Jewish people live in Europe up and through the 20th century? And the answer is the Russian Empire. Really, the country of, it doesn't exist at this point in time, but the country of Poland is where most Jews live. They are invited to live there in the medieval period because those lands were scarcely populated, and the kings of Poland, for example, wanted people to come in and settle, and people who had some sort of skills or could maybe collect taxes for them, and be loyal to the local king because they aren't from there. And then as we get closer to Western Europe, or we get more into Western Europe, you have fewer and fewer in number, but the people who live in the Netherlands or in England or France obviously have the greatest or the best lives, less persecuted perhaps, and less, overt hatred towards Jewish people in more tolerant places, more enlightened places. Well, Jews after the Enlightenment, after the French Revolution, when religion becomes less important, or when toleration of religion becomes part and parcel of pretty much what every state is doing in Western Europe, Jews are getting civil rights. Now people are citizens of countries rather than subjects of kings, and they have more or less the same civil rights as other people. This happens, for example, in France in 1789. It happens it happens in Germany itself in 1871. It happens in the Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg Empire in 1867. Fairly late, but, just like everybody else at this point in time. Going up to that point in time, a number of Western European Jews had started to assimilate. They started to dress like, talk like, and look like their Christian neighbors. And therefore they are less, obviously Jewish, or they don't stick out quite as much. And maybe, like I said, have happier lives than folks who are living in Eastern Europe. I haven't paused for questions. I'll pause for questions if you guys have any. Are we good so far? So I'm going to move on. Sadly, though, for a lot of people, even in those quote-unquote more enlightened countries, old prejudices, crazy prejudices, in fact, remain against Jews. Religiously speaking, Christians make a big deal out of how Jews killed Christ. This doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. Christ had to die for people's sins, but they blame the Jews for shouting at Pontius Pilate that they should crucify Jesus. I love the question they have.
Wasn't Jesus Jewish?
Wait, what? Yes, Jesus apparently was Jewish and the first Christian. I don't know how we deal with that. Some theologians could tell us that. Yes, but maybe he's the first Christian too. I don't know. They say this though. The Jews killed Christ. They bear the responsibility. They bear the weight of that. I don't know. We can say this, though. Since Jews are locked out of so many professions, they have to make their way as best they can economically forever. One of the things that is really pretty amazing is the way that the prohibition of Christians charging interest or usury allowed Jews to get into this loaning of money. Didn't have to worry about the sin aspects of it because, quote unquote, they're damned anyway. So they were loan sharks. They loan money to local business people. They loan money to local people. They loan money in bigger respects to kings and governments and make money off of that. Once again, that's kind of a precarious situation to be in because sometimes people don't want to pay them back. And then the persecution of them or the killing of them, you get rid of your loan. You get rid of your debts to the Jewish person by killing them. So kind of an odd thing. But nonetheless, when we start to move into a more modern economy, Jews become sometimes the middlemen between the countryside and the city. Think about this. How do groceries get into the grocery store? And essentially, Jewish people would go to the countryside, buy things from farmers, bring them to the grocery stores, and the grocers would buy those things from them. The farmers complain that the Jews don't pay them enough money, and then the grocers say that they charge them too much money. Does that make sense? Or eventually, once Jews start to be able to engage in various kinds of professions like doctors and lawyers and artists and so on, then they seem to be very successful, overrepresented in terms of a percentage of their population in lawyering or in doctoring. And then there's all this talk of unfair, too many Jews are lawyers now, that kind of thing. There's also this very successful banking family called the Rothschild family. It's actually a German family from Frankfurt, but they spread all throughout Europe. Think Medici's on steroids. This Rothschild family is an international Jewish banking empire that people back then started saying, the Jews have all the money, or the Rothschilds control everything. They're controlling all the kings and politicians and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's a bunch of nonsense, but because they are an extremely wealthy family and very successful, they are a target. And then you can see these two cute little kids, these little boys that are dressed like, 19th century or early 20th century Jewish people, Jewish children. They wear, distinctive hairstyles, distinctive clothing, hats, and so on. Both boys and girls, men and women. If they are very Orthodox Jewish people, they're going to look different. If they're not maybe quite so assimilated. And in Eastern Europe, they do look really quite distinct. They speak Yiddish, which is a kind of mix of Hebrew and German as their first language, and then they learn all the other languages around them, Russian and Polish, or English and French, or whatever it happens to be. But it makes them easily recognizable, and if people want to pick on them, as they do, sadly, it just is a thing that people do for a long period of time. And here's the new. Out with the old, in with the new. There's new reasons to hate Jews in the era of Darwinism. So people start to view different ethnicities as different species of people. Or they look at different nations as different species of human beings. They start to come up with this racial science. I put in quotes because it's all bunk and nonsense. Anti-Semitism moves away for an intellectual elite from religious reasons to scientific reasons. So anti-Semitism based on what you and I would call genetics, which they don't know anything about, so they just call it, blood and science or race. When Jews are a different species, then converting to Christianity, it seems even kind of like a camouflage or something evil that they're doing, if that makes sense to you. So it's not okay to convert from Judaism to Christianity because it's just further, if you think about an animal or a species trying to survive, camouflage is a wonderful way of going along. So it's viewed as a kind of camouflage. The more assimilated you become, the more diabolical Jewish people are for these anti-Semites. Just to remind you of some stuff that we've talked about, instances, facts, historical events that show us the depths of anti-Semitism, even in fairly progressive countries. There's the Dreyfus Affair. Remember the Dreyfus Affair in France? The Jewish captain is accused of spying for the Germans simply because he's Jewish. Divides France. 1895 to 1910, Christian socialist Karl Lueger, who is the mayor of Vienna. He is, a Catholic politician. Catholics, sadly, tend to be the most anti-Semitic of the peoples, it seems. And I probably mentioned before, who's living in Vienna at this period of time, taking in all of this anti-Semitism? Yeah, thank you, Hitler. I always like to joke, it's Disney, but it's not Disney. It's Hitler. Hitler is, his weird ideas are taken directly from this period of time, directly from this kind of pseudoscientific anti-Semitism. There's a lot of Russian anti-Semitism. We skipped that lecture. I'm sorry we did that. But essentially, the Russians use Jews as a kind of scapegoat over and over and over again to deflect criticism of the Tsar and the government and all the failings of the Romanovs and so on. Every once in a while, they let the local Russian people, the local Christians, have pogroms against the Jews. Have any of you seen the musical? Thank you very much. Fiddler on the Roof. If you haven't seen Fiddler on the Roof, you should really see Fiddler on the Roof. It's really this period of time in Russia, and it really just there's a bunch of fantastic stuff that's associated with that. There's a young man who's a socialist, who's trying to convince one of Tevye's daughters to become a socialist. It's a wonderful thing. You should check it out. Fiddler on the Roof. For some reason, the people in my family kind of like sing or whistle "If I Were a Rich Man," like more often than you would think. I'm walking through the kitchen, I'm like, again with that? If I were a rich man? It's very strange. Speaking of Jews in the 19th century in Russia, there's this thing in Russia called the Pale of Settlement. It gets established under Catherine the Great. You know, the enlightened despot. Catherine the Great says that Jews can't live in St. Petersburg, they can't live in Moscow, they can only really live in the western part of her empire, essentially Poland. And look at the percentage of Jews who are living in this area, sort of in Poland, Russian Poland. Up to 17% of the population is Jewish. It's eventually like 3 million people who, or more than that really, who are living in Poland as Jewish people. About 1/9 of the population in this particular area, about 5 million people, are Jewish. And if you imagine Fiddler on the Roof, you can see that a lot of the Jewish people are living in these little shtetls, these little villages that are Jewish, and living alongside people who aren't, from the next village or whatever. And they seem to be kind of lower middle class or poor people, petite bourgeois people. What does Teddy do? Is he a dairy guy? He delivers milk, I think, to his neighbors. Good. And once again, very distinctive dress, very distinctive language, Yiddish, and easily picked out and picked on. Rolling along. In Russia, which is the most, let's say, backward state, the most, if you've got a backward state, then you've got to figure that old reasons for prejudice are ever present. Like I say, the Russians use nationalism. Russian people are the true, subjects of the Romanovs, and others are not so much. And religious prejudice, then, you've got one faith. You've got the Orthodox faith for a lot of people. And then some Catholicism, I guess. And then the economic competition bit of it. And as I said, anti-Semitism is used to deflect attention from the problems and to rally. I do want to mention, and this is the main thing that you might want to get from this slide, is the Russian secret police create a book. They write a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They do this in 1905. And what they do is create a book that is a conspiracy theory about how Jews are controlling the world. And they do this in order to, give the pogroms some legitimacy or to deflect attention away from the failings of the Tsar and so on. Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It gets translated into many other languages. It gets published. It's extremely popular among anti-Semitic circles. Really, even nowadays, in 2021, there are conspiracy theorists who read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and believe in that. I guess pretty much nowadays you guys can imagine that some people believe pretty much anything. So this is one of those things that has a very lasting effect. And it's just kind of crazy that the Russian secret police are the ones who create this thing. Hitler liked it, of course. So finally, we get to Zionism. There is an Austrian journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl. If you're Jewish, you might have been to a Herzl camp, a summer camp named after him. But Theodor Herzl is influenced, somebody living in Austria, like Hitler from Austria, and living through a lot of anti-Semitic things, a lot of affairs, a lot of situations, and so on. The Lueger as mayor of Vienna, or just in general Christian socialism as a Christian political movement, sort of anti-Semitic political movement. The Dreyfus affair, those things are influencing him. But even back as far as 1896, he writes this thing called the Jewish State, in which he argues, look, Jews have been trying to assimilate forever, and they haven't been allowed. He's not completely right. Let's be honest. Jews in 1500 and Jews in 1900 have very different lives. But this is his point, that Jews are never going to be able to be fully accepted by other people. They're always going to be the outsider. And just like any other people who are a people together, they need nationalism. They need their own state, the Jewish state. In their Jewish state, just like any other people, they'll have their own rights, they'll have their own liberties, they'll be ruled by somebody who's like them. It's just straight up Jewish nationalism. He aims this idea and aims this book not at successful assimilated Jews who are like, what are you talking about? I have made a bunch of money. Think about the Rothschild family, or even think about somebody like Freud, who is apparently doing pretty well. It's aimed at like the people in Fiddler on the Roof, poor Jews in the shtetls, or poor ghetto Jews who haven't been assimilated, who are still living in places where there's quite a bit of prejudice and pogroms. They need to find their own state somehow. That's what he looks like.
Pretty.
Yeah.
He has a nice beard.
He does have a nice beard. I think he's very handsome.
I feel like his haircut is very modern.
I think so too. He looks cool. Well, some Jews did sympathize with Herzl and with Zionism. In fact, they have this first International Zionist Congress. I think that actually might be either the first Congress or one of the Congresses. That might be the basis for a Russian secret policeman sitting around saying, I think the Jews are controlling the world. They're getting together to talk about controlling the world. Type. There's a first International Zionist Congress in 1897, but for the most part, the Jews who can attend these things, or the educated Jews, the wealthier Jews, say, you know what? Judaism isn't a religion. Look at how things have changed over the last 400 years or 200 years. Things are getting better for Jews. If we're just patient, things will continue to get better for Jews to the point where there won't be any more prejudice against Jews. They're hopeful for equality in every way. Well, that sounds good, right? That sounds like a rational thing. It sounds like, if you look at history, that might happen. In the 20th century, Jews will be fully accepted. Except for this really horrible thing that's going to be